Alright, so this is the first video. This is now the 1960s domestic, and I'm going through JFK as well as Johnson here, okay? Now, first off, JFK had been a pretty well-known senator from a fairly well-known wealthy family in Massachusetts. Um, but as senator, he actually had an accident, and while recovering from this accident, he wrote a um, award-winning book called Profiles in Courage, in which he took the lives of several famous senators and said this is what it's like to be great. So this is the first time we really see that Kennedy is a reader, an avid reader, and he likes these type of things that we're going for, and he's going to try to model his life after these 10 senators. Now, I've already talked about the election of 1960 briefly, but I'm going to go into a little more detail. There's three main things going on in the election of 1960. Number one, what are you going to do about the Cold War? This is brought to both Nixon and Kennedy. They both try to portray themselves as Cold Warriors, as it was called, and they were going to have the aggressive hand, and they didn't want to be Eisenhower's puppet, etc. Number two, religion. Kennedy is a Catholic, much like Al Smith in 1928, who was smeared by Herbert Hoover's campaign, but people don't have a problem with that. And the biggest issue, or number three, was television. As you can see here, the thing I have here, we have the first televised debates, Kennedy versus Nixon. And what people saw was, although Nixon might have had better answers, Kennedy seemed more polished, he seemed more in control, he didn't seem as sweaty. He looked like he had been primed for this. And this really changes the way politics are done today. If you remember, the debates are always a big thing to see how someone's going to react under pressure, or are they going to dodge a question, or anything like that. So with all that being said, Kennedy wins, goes into the White House in 1960. Now, around the same time, the 23rd Amendment is passed. Washington, D.C. is not a state, it is a district, hence the D.C. stands for District of Columbia. They did not have an electoral vote. So this one actually rhymes 2-3 in D.C. They get the right to vote for president. It's just kind of one of those things, can they vote, etc. Now, JFK's domestic policy was entitled The New Frontier. The New Frontier focused on moving forward. Some big things that he's going to really try to highlight are civil rights legislation, health care for the elderly, aid to education, urban renewal, military and space programs, and also containment of communism. So that's all falling under what is called the New Frontier. Okay? Unfortunately, he only got 2 short years, and as he's trying to run for re-election, he will be assassinated, and that's a subject to another video we'll look at in a minute. Now, in his inaugural address, he makes several. This is probably one of the better inaugural addresses for aesthetic purposes. The first thing he says is the torch has been passed to a new generation. He's going to be our youngest president, elected to this point in 1960. And so he's basically saying the old guard's out, we need somebody else in. But this quote I gave you here is probably the biggest one. He said, "My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." To put it away, I had a former student a few years ago who said, stop asking for a hand out and start helping out, is kind of a big way of putting it. So, there it is, the inaugural address, and we're going to disseminate this in class and talk a lot about this because this is a seminal document in your packets. I love going through this because it sets the stage, and people have made allusions to this speech for years afterwards. Now, as I mentioned with the Roberts, flexible response is brought up. Now, flexible response means a buildup of conventional troops and weapons to go with the nuclear arsenal that we have in case we have to combat this. They basically said we can't take on large number of troops with nuclear weapons or anything like that. So flexible response is there in case, apples to apples, oranges to oranges, I guess. Now, some organizations that Kennedy is going to be responsible for setting up first is called Peace Corps. First off, Peace Corps is kind of an army of doves, is what I like to refer to it. It is a voluntary, non-military service where you go to basically third world countries. A lot of work is done in Africa recently, and you're going to help them develop. And the main goal of this, number one, is that if they're developing, they're not going to fall to communism. These third world countries are more susceptible to the threat and everything that is communism. So, if we can get them to see the great things that democracy has, they won't fall to communism. So, therein was the point of the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps is still continuing today. Now, the other one was called a Vista. Now, Vista is kind of like, what is that thing called? City Corps, something like that. You basically give up a year and you go and help these people out. Vista is a voluntary service, and you can see it right there. You're trying to fight poverty at this point. So they're fighting poverty with passion. It is a voluntary service. Both of these groups are going to be just kind of helping people to get out and, as he said, ask what you can do for your country. Voluntary service. Now, there existed another America. Michael Harrington, who is a socialist, actually went and lived in these inner city people of Rust Belt places that I've talked about before, and he writes The Other America. Now, here's a quote for you. He says, "The other America, America in poverty, is hidden today in a way that it never was before. Millions are socially invisible to the rest of us." He's basically saying this whole idea of affluency we've been talking about in the 40s and 50s is a farce or a fake movement. And in fact, there's so much more that has to be done. Now, Kennedy gets a hold of this book, and ultimately he decides to make the decision, I've got to address these issues, and Johnson's going to carry that torch even after Kennedy's gone. So, important stuff there. Now, the last part of the New Frontier was space programs, right? So beginning in 1962, really, and really after 63, we're going to race for the moon. Now, why do we race for the moon? And this is actually something McNamara brings up that's really cool. After we signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, advisors came to McNamara and said, we got to put money into the moon. The Russians are going to cheat. And he goes, how are they going to cheat? They're going to get to the moon, and on the dark side of the moon, Pink Floyd album, named for that reason, they're going to test stuff. So we put all this time and effort to beating them to the moon. Finally, in 1969, through Apollo 11, Apollo were the moon missions. So it took them 11 tries, basically, to figure out how to get there. Neil Armstrong will be the first man on the moon, uttering the words, "This is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." He's also going to say the Eagle has landed. This is where also we get the term, Roger and ground control, etc. And in fact, David Bowie made a great song kind of maybe around these lines called Major Tom, the late David Bowie, in which he said, ground control to Major Tom. And that's kind of taking things he heard from this. Now, Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. However, I would say his compatriot, his fellow astronaut, Buzz Aldrin, is a little bit more well known. Now, why do I say that? Because in Toy Story, what's the name of the astronaut toy? It's not Neil. It's Buzz Lightyear. Part of the reason is Buzz Aldrin, his family had invested in Pixar, and there's all kinds of ties there. So just really cool stuff. But Buzz is the second man on the moon, not the first. So maybe we need a Neil toy in the next Toy Story. Look that up, Pixar. Toy Story 4, Neil. But the next video deals with the big thing everybody wants to talk about, and that is the assassination.